Thank you all for being here. Here at the National Archives, we thought it would be a good idea to look back at the reaction to the AIDS epidemic when it emerged as a threat in the early 1980s, to explore the resonance that this might hold for us now in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. While researching this talk in January, I was very pleased to discover that Channel 4 was going to show It's a Sin, the Russell T Davies drama about AIDS set in the 1980s, which has received widespread acclaim. It is excellent, so it's all very timely. The government documents I'm going to show you are held at the National Archives. I want to convey the sheer richness of our holdings on the subject, including some material that has remained largely unseen up to now. I am also using some documentation from external sources. My particular focus in this talk is on the years 1986 to 87, a period that Virginia Berridge, in her book AIDS in the UK, has called the government's wartime emergency response to AIDS. But of course, I'm going to set this in context. And thinking back to that period, it's important to remember that homosexuality had been partially decriminalised barely 20 years previously in 1967, and that the age of consent for gay men had been set at 21. So let's head back to the 1980s. In 1987 came the first same-sex kiss in a British soap between the characters Colin and Barry in EastEnders. Colin, played by Michael Cashman, was portrayed as a middle-class yuppie, and for those who are not sure what that term stood for, it meant young, upwardly mobile professional. And his character was in his mid-30s, and his love interest was Barry, who was played by Gary Hales, who was a working-class barrow boy about 15 years younger than Colin, and he sold records on the market. In this scene, Colin merely gives Barry a peck on the forehead, but this caused a furore, which seems incredible now. In his biography, Michael Cashman, who went on to become a co-founder of Stonewall, wrote, "In the heady anti-gay AIDS plague hysteria, it smacked the opposition in the face. The phone lines to the BBC were besieged, the protest mail piled in, the tabloids misrepresented it as sexual content, and the moral bonfire was ignited. The reaction was nasty." The Sun ran an article headed East Benders. It was brave of EastEnders to introduce two gay characters into the soap at this time, and they went on to develop an AIDS-related storyline. Some of you listening out there will recall this famous episode. To others, it happened before they were born. But the reason I'm relating it to you is to hook you into that period, 1986 to 87, when, broadly speaking, attitudes to homosexuality were nothing like as liberal as they are today. In the British Social Attitudes Survey of 1987, 74% of those surveyed agreed with the statement that homosexual relations are always or mostly wrong. To grasp this is crucial to understanding the historical context for my talk today, for by the mid-1980s a new deadly threat had emerged in the form of AIDS, and the vast majority of those who contracted AIDS, or who were living with HIV, the virus that can cause AIDS, were gay men. And that is the reason why the particular focus of my talk today is bound up with the impact of AIDS on gay and bisexual men. And of course, I'm not referring purely to white gay men. Black, gay and bisexual men were affected too. It's just that I haven't come across any breakdowns by ethnicity in the course of my research. Women were also directly affected because HIV transmission could occur through heterosexual contact. HIV infection could also be passed on to newborns. But as I've said, the majority of those who contracted AIDS or who were living with HIV, the virus that can cause AIDS, in the UK in the 1980s were gay men. And so the impact on this community is my focus today. It's important to make the point that women were also powerful allies of gay men during the crisis, demonstrated by the character Jill, played by Lydia West in It's a Sin. Her story symbolised the role of many women who cared for gay and bisexual men affected by the disease. Many lesbians took on a caring role in looking after men with AIDS, and many of the unfortunate barriers which sometimes existed between gay men and lesbians came down during the crisis. Women were also at the forefront of campaigning and fundraising work, and trans people also made a strong contribution. Again, before proceeding, let's just take a moment to think back to the 1980s. Martin Weaver, former press officer for the Terence Higgins Trust, makes this important point in his fascinating AIDS archive, which you can see on YouTube. Back then, there was no internet, no social media, no mobiles or smartphones. So the only ways of communicating messages or connecting with the public on a national basis were through the national press, radio and TV, and there were just 3 TV channels, which became 4 in 1982 with the birth of Channel 4. There was no rolling news, no 24-hour rolling news then either. So news about the emergence of AIDS came out in dribs and drabs. And this is something to keep in your mind as we explore this story. AIDS evoked horror, fear, and panic when it first emerged, and the fact that most of the victims were gay men was, as Jeffrey Weeks has written, the decisive element in the social response to AIDS. As he put it, the social response reflected the unfinished revolution in attitudes towards homosexuality. When did AIDS become an issue in Britain? Reports of a gay cancer that was affecting American gay men began to appear on television news, I think as early as 1980. And I can remember how disturbing and chilling it was to see these news reports. The illness had not acquired the description AIDS yet, but related symptoms included rare forms of pneumonia and unexplained weight loss. This syndrome initially acquired the acronym GRID, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency. As a gay man struggling to come out at the time, it really was doom-laden news for me. It filled me with apprehension. The first known case of AIDS in the UK was in 1981. Over the next 2 to 3 years, awareness started to grow and the response within the gay community became more pronounced, particularly after the death of Terence Higgins, a 37-year-old computer programmer who died in July 1982 at St Thomas's Hospital. He died surrounded by strict infection control techniques, what was known as double barrier nursing. Terence, or Terry, was one of the first people in the UK to die of an AIDS-related illness. His death brought his friends together to establish a fundraising organisation for research into the illness. They set up the Terry Higgins Trust, which later became the Terence Higgins Trust. Of course, there was a great deal of scientific uncertainty in 1981 to 82 about the causes of this so-called gay cancer. The breakthrough came in 1983 at the Pasteur Institute in France, when it became clear to scientists that a virus was involved in its transmission, and further research conducted by scientists in the US announced in April 1984, which identified the cause of AIDS as a retrovirus and labelled it HTLV3. It soon became possible to test people for the virus. Before proceeding further, we should define terms. AIDS stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. It was given that description around 1982. And AIDS is the name for a collection of illnesses caused by the HIV virus. HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus. Immunodeficiency refers to the weakening of the immune system by the virus. Over time, understanding developed, and it became clear that if someone with HIV has a detectable viral load, they can pass on HIV through blood, semen, vaginal fluid, anal mucus, and breast milk. For many years, scientists put forward theories as to the origins of HIV and how it appeared in the human population. It has been linked, and I believe with a good degree of credibility, I don't think it's a myth, to a subspecies of chimpanzees native to West and Central Equatorial Africa as the original source of the virus. I've mentioned that the breakthroughs on the medical causes of AIDS were made in 1983 and the spring of 1984. But in terms of high-level government activity about AIDS, our files show that the upper levels of government became galvanized about the issue in the course of 1985. What had been going on in 1984 into 1985 before the government health campaign came about? There was a lot of research going on at the Department of Health, which was addressing the problem of contaminated blood infected with HIV and hepatitis viruses given to hemophiliacs and people with other bleeding disorders. In terms of getting factual information out to gay and bisexual men, elements within the gay community had started to organise themselves. Volunteers started visiting pubs and clubs with leaflets bearing the known facts. They didn't always get a good reception in the early days. Sometimes the reaction was one of disbelief. This aspect is covered in It's a Sin. The London Lesbian and Gay Switchboard was a leading source of information about HIV/AIDS, and the Terence Higgins Trust opened their helpline in February 1984. The Health Education Council produced this leaflet in 1985. The British press began to use the highly distasteful term gay plague in 1983, and it became a preoccupation of the tabloids, particularly between 1983 to 1985. Factual accuracy in their reporting was poor. The strong impression was given that AIDS was far more infectious than it was in reality. The Sun claimed that AIDS was spreading like wildfire. Another Sun headline proclaimed, "AIDS is the wrath of God, says Vicar." There were some who held to the view that homosexuality was an abomination and unnatural, and that by going against nature, gay people had brought this plague upon themselves, that it was divine retribution. I would describe such a view as ignorant, offensive, and plain wrong, but there we are. The Chief Constable of Manchester, James Anderton, gave a speech in which he said, "Everywhere I go, I see increasing evidence of people swirling about in a human cesspit of their own making. We must ask why homosexuals freely engage in sodomy and other obnoxious practices, knowing the dangers involved." You can see in Hansard that around this time, some MPs casually refer to gay people as perverts. The pop group Bronski Beat, who were out and proud and fronted by Jimmy Somerville, took the perverts insult as a badge of honour and held a benefit concert to aid the striking miners in December 1984, proclaiming the event as Pits and Perverts. And I'm pretty sure if you've seen the film Pride, I think they show a banner with that heading at one point. These were the times. An hysteria grew up around AIDS. Some people believe that you could catch HIV from toilet seats, or from sharing communal baths, or from any close contact with an HIV positive person or person with AIDS, including from shaking hands or from any objects or surfaces that they had touched. The government gave funds to the Terence Higgins Trust in September 1985. The Chief Medical Officer, Sir Donald Aitchison, was instrumental in moving AIDS up the government's agenda in the course of 1985, and the government machine had become galvanised by the issue of AIDS by early 1986. Norman Fowler was Health Secretary, and he was alarmed by increases in AIDS cases. As he wrote in his book, AIDS, Don't Die of Prejudice, my view was that we needed a direct advertising campaign explaining how the virus was contracted and warning that there were no drugs or vaccinations that could be used to counter it. The prospect for those who ignored these warnings was death. The government had to go into some detail about sexual practices and drug taking. As Fowler wrote, it was not a time to be delicate. The public needed to understand what AIDS was, how infection occurred, and how to protect yourself from it. This was prevention through education. Norman Fowler proposed a newspaper advertising campaign in early 1986. Norman Fowler had been Health Secretary since 1981. Although he's on record as stating that when he first knew about AIDS as a serious issue, he knew little about the gay community and had few gay friends. He could not understand why there was opposition to gay people purely on grounds of their sexual orientation. He believed passionately that prejudice should not stand in the way of a campaign to prevent HIV and AIDS from spreading. He showed a great deal of drive and determination in this matter, as did the Chief Medical Officer, Sir Donald Aitchison. The other key player in this story was, of course, the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, who was now well into her second term of office, somewhat buffeted by the Westland affair, but generally maintaining a firm grip on government business and strategy and beginning to contemplate the next election. So here we see a memo by David Willits of the Policy Unit, and note that he's saying here to the Prime Minister, Norman Fowler is proposing to place explicit and distasteful advertisements about AIDS in all the Sunday papers. Well, although he described the newspaper adverts as distasteful, he agreed with the need for a health campaign. The draft advertisement is going to be considered by the Home Affairs H Committee of the Cabinet. Now, on this memo, just above the typed part of it, you can see Mrs. Thatcher's writing in blue felt tip pen, where she's written, "Do we have to have the section on risky sex? I should have thought it could do immense harm if young teenagers were to read it." So Mrs. Thatcher's concerns clearly focused on the language used to explain about the sexual practices which could lead to HIV infection, specifically unprotected anal sex. And Mrs. Thatcher's concern was that the text of the advert would put into the minds of young teenagers sexual practices, particularly anal sex, which they would apparently never have heard of otherwise, encouraging them to experiment with a practice that the government was trying to discourage. So the controversial passage, as it were, was the reference to anal intercourse. The draft advertisement referred to this as anal back passage intercourse. The phrasing was fretted about a huge amount. Following Mrs. Thatcher's comments, the phrase was changed to rectal sex. This is the other part of that memo by David Willits, and it shows why senior members of the government had started to become galvanized about the issue at this time, because it seems that they were worried about a spread of the HIV virus to the heterosexual population through drug takers or through prostitution. The Home Affairs Committee decided to proceed with the advertisement despite Mrs. Thatcher's concerns. The Prime Minister continued to battle. She even wondered if the advertisement might fall foul of the Obscene Publications Act. She was assured it would not. You can see her writing again here. I remain against certain parts of this advertisement. I think the anxiety on the part of parents and many teenagers who would never be in danger from AIDS exceeds the good that it would do. It would be better, in my view, to follow the wartime precedent, VD precedent, of putting notices in surgeries, public lavatories, etc. On this last point, Norman Fowler wrote in his book, as for the Prime Minister's idea of confining messages to public lavatories and surgeries, there was no evidence that, in the late 1980s, with all modern communication techniques at our disposal, this was remotely the best we could do. The world had moved on. I'll come back to that point about Second World War campaign about venereal disease. Norman Fowler's response to Mrs. Thatcher's concerns was really pretty robust, stressing the urgency of the matter, but he made the following amendment to the text, which I think I've mentioned. Rectal sex involves the highest risk and should be avoided. And Thatcher then gave the go-ahead, and the adverts appeared in the press in March and April. Hardly any complaints were received. And this is part of the newspaper advert which was published in the press on the 17th of March 1986. Note that in the third column, where with the heading "What is risky sex?" you can see there the phrasing that was finally agreed: rectal sex involves the highest risk and should be avoided. In June, Fowler made it known to Willie Whitelaw, Lord President of the Council, who became a central figure in this whole business, that he wanted a new round of advertising in the newspapers to maintain momentum, but drawing on evidence from surveys of public opinion, he wanted to use shorter text and simpler language. Lord Hailsham was the Lord Chancellor at this time, and this is his reaction to Fowler's new proposals. Lord Hailsham was very focused on the language, even the grammar used. So if you just look at his handwritten comments on this memo, he's saying sex means that you are either male or female. It does not mean the same thing as sexual practice, nor does having sex mean anything at all. Mr. Fowler insisted that the phrase anal sex should be used instead of rectal sex because the rectal sex was insufficiently understood, and he got his way on that. Norman Fowler kept up the tempo with the campaign, and in August he proposed that a leaflet be delivered to every household in the country, spelling out in simple and explicit language what they needed to know about AIDS. This was Mrs. Thatcher's first reaction to this proposal. Why universal delivery of AIDS leaflet, but nothing about drugs? My first reaction is against the idea, but I await further comments. Mrs. Thatcher clearly felt at this time that more emphasis should be put on countering the spread of HIV infection through drug use, through contaminated needles. Nicholas Edwards, the Secretary of State for Wales, also had misgivings about the danger of offence. He was arguing that, if you put material through people's doors, you give them no choice but to receive it, and he was worried about the possible exposure of children to this information. Lord Hailsham also had major doubts about the leaflet drop and expressed concern that it would cause controversy, offence, and might well spread panic. The H Committee was split on the matter, and again Mrs. Thatcher expressed concern about the various risks attached to the proposal. Norman Fowler reflected, "As I was taught in my army days, if you come up against an immovable object, try to go around it." His team at the Health Department came up with the idea of a special AIDS cabinet committee that would be well equipped to make speedy decisions. There was a problem. Such a committee was likely to be chaired by the Prime Minister, but then the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Robert Armstrong, took a lead and persuaded the Prime Minister that her deputy, Willie Whitelaw, would be best placed to chair the committee. Whitelaw was, in Fowler's words, an inspired choice. He had had oversight of sexual health services for the army forces in Cairo at one stage during the Second World War. His approach was pragmatic, and the committee was soon making good progress. During the last quarter of 1986, the media was getting increasingly interested in the subject of AIDS, and advisors to the Prime Minister started to impart advice to her which implied that she needed to shift her position about the leaflet and the campaign in general. Her chief press officer, Bernard Ingham, wrote this memo to David Willetts on the 29th of October. David Willetts took on board Bernard Ingham's comments and made a highly persuasive case to the Prime Minister for agreeing to the leaflet. Couple of things to pick out here. One of the points he makes is that towards the bottom, there was not a single complaint about obscenity in the newspaper advertisements earlier this summer. Note also that Willetts is saying that the leaflet may be backed by TV advertisements. More about that shortly. Mrs. Thatcher agreed to the leaflet drop to go ahead, which it did in January 1987. And here we see some images of the leaflet. Next, on the 30th of December, Fowler proposed that he should deliver a ministerial broadcast about AIDS in January, but the Prime Minister refused. You can see her comments in the left-hand corner here on Norman Fowler's memo. It reads, "I am against it. A leaflet dropped to every house is to explain the reason why. To take the first ministerial broadcast for 8 years would, in my view, be wrong." Mr. Fowler visited Number 10 on New Year's Eve to discuss the matter further with the Prime Minister over a whisky in her study, but her mind was made up. According to Fowler's account, referring to a ministerial broadcast, she says she has not had one on the Falklands, on the riots, or on any other health issue. Fowler writes that the Prime Minister did see AIDS as a very serious health threat, but he goes on to write that at one point she said to him, "You mustn't become known as just the Minister for AIDS." Fowler simply felt that he had a duty to warn the public of the dangers. Earlier, I drew attention to David Willetts' comment that the leaflet campaign may be backed by TV adverts, and yes, indeed it was. Anyone of a certain age who lived through the 1980s will remember these TV adverts, particularly the AIDS monolith advert. I'm going to show you these two advertisements now.
There is now a danger that has become a threat to us all. It is a deadly disease and there is no known cure. The virus can be passed during sexual intercourse with an infected person. Anyone can get it, man or woman. So far, it's been confined to small groups, but it's spreading. So protect yourself and read this leaflet when it arrives. If you ignore AIDS, it could be the death of you. So don't die of ignorance.
Powerful stuff. So here you can see the storyboard for the AIDS TV advert by advertising agency TBWA. The actor John Hurt did the voiceover for that chilling Tombstone advert known as AIDS Monolith. And John Hurt was, of course, in the first Alien film of 1979, and his strong association with that role is another factor at play here. Here is something new, terrifying, and alien. There's a feel of the nuclear winter about these adverts and an apocalyptic tone. The iceberg advert carries the message that this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of people who may be infected and who don't realize it. This advert was shown in cinemas. Some people were critical of the adverts because of the lack of detailed advice within them, but the thinking was, we only have about 40 seconds. We need to make an impact, something that will make people stop in their tracks, reflect, and pay attention to the Don't Die of Ignorance leaflet, which was being put through every household's door. And in those terms, I think it was highly successful. I've mentioned the press earlier, particularly the very unhelpful coverage of the tabloid press in 1984 to 85, as well as the more responsible approach of other newspapers. But television had a different role. In February 1987, there was an AIDS week across the 4 TV channels which were broadcasting at that time, and this arose out of detailed planning in government and discussion between the networks. Look at these audience day-by-day figures for Friday the 27th of February. AIDS The Facts was broadcast on 2 channels and presented by Janice Long and Ian Jury, and it was watched by 8.1 million people. First AIDS on ITV was watched by 8.3 million. It was a show full of sketches aimed at informing young people of the dangers of AIDS, starring comedians and rock stars. The implied message with this advert is, don't think that AIDS is only a problem for gay men and drug takers. However, by early 1987, the Department of Health was developing a new strategy. They wanted to change the emphasis of the AIDS campaign to begin to target the at-risk groups, including gay men and business travelers, for example. Around February 1987, an advertising agency was presenting to the Department of Health mock-ups of adverts which were intended to target gay men specifically using the gay press. These were never used, and the whole notion of targeting gay men in this way was shelved by the government, and nothing happened on this particular front until the Health Education Authority ran some adverts in the gay press in 1989. I will come on to the reasons why this was the case shortly, but first, let's take a look at some of them, the themes they explored, and the messages they were trying to get across. They powerfully conjure up the atmosphere of the time, and some of them also reflect the hairstyles and fashions of the late 1980s. Be warned that sometimes shock tactics are used, some are distastefully blunt as they try to ram home the message, and predictably there is a grimness about many of them. This first one plays on fears of premature aging and unsightly sores. This shock tactic approach seems to lack sympathy for anyone suffering from AIDS. This image is obviously black and white, but note the use of the symbolic pink triangle. Initially, of course, this was intended as a badge of shame by the Nazis, but it was increasingly used in the 1980s both as a memorial and as a positive symbol of gay identity. I'm very wary of generalizations, but some would say that in the 1980s, promiscuity was a big feature of the gay scene, with many gay men picking up partners for casual sex in the pubs, bars, and clubs. And many of the prototype adverts were trying to convey the message: you can't tell who is carrying the HIV virus. So if you are indulging in casual sex without taking precautions, i.e., not using a condom for anal sex, then you are playing Russian roulette with your life chances. Remember, at this time, there were no vaccines and no effective treatments to counter AIDS. So there's a very bleak message being delivered here. Note they're using a sort of slogan, we've all got to live with AIDS, at the bottom of that advert. This is a particularly interesting example. Only one person knows which one of these men has the AIDS virus. Another message that they wanted to get across was one that was already being championed by self-help groups within the gay community. Take precautions, avoid risks, but safe sex is fun. Use your imagination. So that theme was reflected in this advert and also in this one. Just a point for clarification, the Health Education Authority, the HEA, had assumed responsibility for the AIDS education campaign in October 1987. So, why was an advertising campaign targeting gay men shelved in 1987? There were several reasons. The proposed campaign material was pre-tested using a survey of gay men and was found to be ineffective in encouraging safer sex behaviour. I've been looking for the survey information within the files, but haven't found it as yet. But this was the reported state of affairs. An AIDS advertising brief dated November the 5th, 1987 stated, the HEA's conclusion is that much of the material developed so far is unsuitable for the gay audience and may antagonize many gay men by suggesting promiscuity is the norm among them. Some officials realized that such a campaign could be criticized as being homophobic or condescending, and perhaps some of the mock-up adverts we've seen, while well-intentioned, might be considered as talking down to people. It was also realized that not all gay men were on the scene, and that only a certain percentage read the gay press. Some ministers would be opposed to such a campaign. Some MPs would have had qualms about the content of some of those mocked up adverts. And some DHSS officials were also very cautious in their approach. Some gay organisations and spokespeople lobbying the government did not want a government campaign targeting gay men, as they felt it could have the effect of stigmatising the gay community. This was a highly sensitive issue. In any case, there was a danger of duplicating work that was already being done very effectively by organisations such as the Terence Higgins Trust. Section 28, or Clause 28 of the Local Government Bill, which became law in 1988, may have been used as an excuse in some quarters not to target gay men with health publicity. Clause 28 stated that a local authority shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality, and this had an inhibiting effect, leading to a great deal of self-censorship among groups connected with local authorities. Was the public education campaign as a whole effective? I think it's a fair claim to say yes, it was. In a Gallup report of 1987, well over 90% of the public had seen the advertising. 94% 84% thought the government was right to be doing the advertising they had seen, and only 7% found elements of it offensive. Those TV adverts made a deep impression. Norman Fowler has written, "There is no doubt that it was the television advertisements which had the most impact and did most to save lives. Knowledge about AIDS had increased dramatically and condom use increased. There was also a marked decrease in sexually transmitted disease among gay men, um, and as I understand it, in the heterosexual population as well. So um, rates of infection with syphilis and gonorrhea, these came down. And the prospect that AIDS would spread into the general population did not materialize. In the later part of the 1980s, some commentators started to make a case that the response to AIDS had been a gay conspiracy, that the government had been duped into spending lots of money on this. Whether or not the government overreacted in 1986 to 87 remains a matter for debate. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. It's easy to be wise after the event. As the old saying goes, you are damned if you do and damned if you don't. The Terence Higgins Trust noted that France, Spain and Italy were slower to react to the spread of AIDS than the UK, and levels of infection of HIV in those countries was considerably worse in comparison. It's very important to remember the work of charities and activists in the gay community who played a significant part in the fight against AIDS. The gay community adopted safer sex practices on a widespread basis. According to Jeffrey Weeks, this owed almost nothing to outside influences, but was a spontaneous development within the gay community itself once the routes of transmission had become clear from about 1983. In general, gay men changed their behaviour around sex. Friends had started dying. What more salutary reminder could there be for the need to adopt safe sex practices? Gay men took up a leading role in the various organisations and charities that sprang up, including the Terence Higgins Trust, Body Positive and Frontliners, and a lot of effort went into fundraising to support phone lines and hospices. One particular individual had a tremendous effect in transforming attitudes to people with HIV and AIDS at this time of crisis in the 1980s. In April 1987, Princess Diana opened the UK's first purpose-built HIV/AIDS unit at London Middlesex Hospital. With the TV cameras rolling, Princess Diana shook the hand of a man suffering with the illness. She did so without gloves, and so directly challenged the myth that HIV/AIDS was passed from person to person by touch. This was compassion winning out over ignorance, fear and prejudice, and it was the first of several visits by Princess Diana to AIDS units and hospices, some in public and some in private. And here's something that many people are not aware of. On the 3rd of August 1989, Mrs. Thatcher visited the Mildmay Mission Hospital in the East End of London, the first AIDS hospice in Europe. This was revealed by Caroline Slowcock, who was her private secretary in 1989 to 1990, in her book People Like Us, Mrs. Thatcher and Me. In this book, it is also revealed that Mrs. Thatcher wanted no publicity or cameras for this visit. She is quoted as saying, "I don't want people to think I am trying to copy Princess Diana." At the Mildmay, the Prime Minister met two men who were dying from AIDS. Caroline Slowcock's account reveals that Mrs. Thatcher was sympathetic, kind and caring when engaging with the two patients. Charles Moore, in his authorised biography of Margaret Thatcher, Volume 3, revealed that, after the visit, on the same day in fact, Mrs. Thatcher wrote a handwritten letter of thanks to the Mildmay matron and enclosed a cheque for £1,000 from her own resources as a donation. As we have seen, Norman Fowler certainly had his battles with the Iron Lady, but he is very fair-minded about her role in the AIDS crisis. He wrote that Margaret Thatcher may have grumbled, but, with the exception of the cancelled ministerial broadcast, She did not veto our efforts. This is an important point. It would be very easy to write Mrs. Thatcher up as the villain of this story, given her initial reluctance over explicit language and the leaflet drop, and her support for Clause 28, which became law in May 1988. But I don't believe in a heroes and villains approach to history. I think it's important to try and incorporate all the parts of the jigsaw puzzle of the past, even the bits that don't seem at first glance to fit with the rest, to give a fair and as balanced a view as possible. Well, what happened to AIDS as a public issue after 1986 to 87? After those years, AIDS began to fade as a strong national issue. It was increasingly seen as a non-epidemic disease and was classified as a chronic, long-term disease. Perhaps there was an element of inevitability that the issue would go off the boil. You could not repeat the same shock tactics encapsulated in the TV adverts time and time again. It sounds trite to say this, but the deaths of high-profile public figures from AIDS, such as Rock Hudson, Rudolf Nureyev, and Freddie Mercury, reminded the general public of the tragic loss of life that the disease had brought. As David Frost once said, "Death is not the great leveler, death reveals the eminent." In the early 1990s, drug therapies to treat HIV/AIDS started to be used more and more, and over time, new classes of drugs and combinations of these have greatly expanded the lifespan of people with AIDS, and the PrEP drug significantly reduces the risk of contracting HIV. AIDS hasn't gone away. According to UN AIDS, there were approximately 38 million people across the globe with HIV or AIDS in 2019. About 7.1 million did not know they were living with HIV. Millions of men and women who are already infected do not know their condition. As Norman Fowler argues, this shows the need for substantially increased testing. That applies in Britain and worldwide. It should be said that Lord Fowler remains a tireless campaigner on HIV and AIDS issues. HIV status still presents problems for people in terms of stigmatization. World AIDS Day on December the 1st and support for this from high-profile celebrities have helped to keep the issue in the public eye. The AIDS story continues, and the archives will continue to record developments. As you know, the title of my talk refers to prejudice, prevention, and publicity, but I came to realize that perhaps I should have put another word in beginning with P, progress. For there was progress in the 1980s towards a much more liberal, open outlook towards homosexuality in society, and you can see this in the greater visibility of gayness, or shall we say sexual ambiguity, in the pop world during the 1980s. In the case of some artists, it was coded or implied or just ambiguous. Other artists expressed gayness more directly. And the following slide shows the impact in culture more generally. Just look at all these TV, film and theatre productions with LGBT stories or themes. The Normal Heart was a powerful play by Larry Kramer about the HIV/AIDS crisis in New York City in the early 1980s. I'm indebted to Matt Cook, who drew on this data from the British Social Attitudes Survey in his excellent lecture, Archives of Feeling, the AIDS Crisis in Britain, circa 1987, which you can see online. So if you look at these figures, note that there was a hardening of attitudes in 1987, coinciding with the peak of public concern about AIDS. This is the really telling evidence showing the shift in public opinion regarding homosexuality in Britain from 1983 to 2018, and it's a positive note to end on, but let's not forget that some 70 countries and territories worldwide continue to criminalize same-sex relationships. There I will conclude my talk. Thank you for listening. There will now be an opportunity to ask questions.